I'm disappointed that I came to Canada, a Canada that it is very, very difficult to find Canadians who are passionate about the American-Canadian relationship. Okay? You ran a campaign where, it was anti-American, elbows up, me too. It was an anti-American campaign. That has continued. That's disappointing.
Guys, the U.S. ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, is disappointed in Canadians.
Yeah. Seems like feelings have been hurt. I guess he doesn't like the hockey analogies, eh? Maybe there's some college football analogy that Pete Hoekstra would prefer. I don't know.
Probably not the CFL, though. I'm Catherine Cullen, host of CBC's The House.
I'm Daniel Thibeault, Radio-Canada's Ottawa Bureau Chief and host of our political show, Les Coulisses du Pouvoir.
And I'm Jason Markusoff, producer and writer for CBC in Calgary.
And this is House Party, a weekly podcast diving into the big burning questions driving the political conversation. This week we're asking, are hurt feelings getting in the way of a Canada-U.S. deal? Okay, we're going to talk about hurt feelings. Let's start with me, Dan. Where are you? You've abandoned me. Not really. You're working very hard. You are at the United Nations in New York. We're recording this late Tuesday morning, and you're covering the Prime Minister's trip there this week.
I know. I'm so sorry. It's so much better to be right beside you. But I had to join you. It's not a little trip to New York that's going to make me skip that little conversation we have.
We always want Dan at our party. So this week, the question we are asking on House Party, do you think hurt feelings are hurting the Canada-U.S. relationship? Carney has been asked while he's in New York City, certainly about that Canada-U.S. relationship. So we'll start with you, Dan. What's your take?
You know what? Has it been hurt? Possibly. There's so many reasons why the Americans right now seem to take offense of something that we do. We say it's a tax, it's a statement, it's a measure, it's a counter tariff. Was there any way around that? I don't think so. I think what was put forward by the previous administration and what Prime Minister Carney followed on was necessary, and it was appreciated by the Canadian public. It was requested in a lot of cases by Canadians. So I don't think there was any way around it. I think it had to be done. Obviously, the ambassador doesn't seem to appreciate that particular move. I don't think there's any way around it. I think it has to be done, and if it has a bit of impact on the negotiation, so be it.
Jason?
We've learned over time that it doesn't really matter what the U.S. ambassador says or what any of the Trump cabinet ministers saying. They may have Trump ear from time to time, but ultimately it really doesn't matter what they say. It matters what Trump says. It would matter, 9 million times more if Trump was saying this, and it would signal much more about his thinking if he himself was saying that, at least his thinking that day. And I think what seems to matter at the end of the day on this stuff is that Trump seems to like Mark Carney in a way he really didn't like Justin Trudeau. And of course, that could change on a dime.
I think there's one interesting thing that I picked up from conversations while I was here, is that the understanding usually is that when an ambassador make a statement somewhere, it's usually because he was requested, he was asked to make that statement. It's something that your boss back home would like you to convey as a message. I'm not sure we can say, and I agree with Jason on that. I think it might be something that someone said to the U.S. ambassador in Ottawa. You should mention that. I'm not sure if it came from Donald Trump, and if it did come from Donald Trump, I don't know how long it's valid. And Jason was right. He likes Prime Minister Carney. The two will actually meet later tonight at a cocktail party. I doubt the U.S. president will go to Carney and say, "I hate that campaign you started." I think it's something that he may move away from fairly quickly.
I will say, though, I do think there's a line you can draw between what Donald Trump said on Tuesday to the United Nations. He said, the world is respecting us like never before. And I do see, I take your point, Dan, that it's not on orders, but I do see a through line between Donald Trump's desire for the world to respect him and Pete Hoekstra's frustration and, in his words, disappointment at how Canadians are behaving. Like, if we try to think about this from Pete Hoekstra's perspective, I'm sure it is pretty disappointing that you get a diplomatic posting and you show up and people are like, man, the guy you are representing is cheesing us off. And I think we can all understand him being very polite as I express this. I'm sure that's disappointing for Pete Hoekstra. I did think his choice of words was interesting. Canadians aren't passionate. I think Pete Hoekstra's problem actually is that Canadians are very passionate about this. What he means is passionate about our two countries working together, and that he's just not seeing a lot of that. But I do wonder whether there is any level of strategy here, saying this to a business audience. If there is a particular impact that the ambassador was hoping to have.
I think what he's trying to do, and this makes sense, is to plant a seed of doubt in people's mind. To make people think that there's a downside. You guys can have your feelings, but we listen, we pay attention. And to plant a seed of doubt in people's minds that the anti-American sentiment, the lack of attention, that Trump could get angry, you could be making Trump angry. That's not going to affect everybody, but there'll be some people out there who will think that this, maybe we should tone down some of it. And Pete Hoekstra keeps wanting to say that, forget about the 51st state. We've moved off that months ago. But I think to a lot of Canadians, it's really hard to do that until Trump says that. And Trump hasn't really, he'll stop saying it from time to time, but usually whenever he's asked by a reporter, usually a Canadian reporter, he will say, yeah, I'd still love for them to be the 51st state. They'll see the benefits. The other thing about what he's doing is the political environment in which it lands. If he's trying to plant a seed of doubt, there'll be some maybe in the business community, we can talk about that later on, but the Conservatives certainly won't and haven't been picking up the ball that he's been tossing to them, if he's tossing it to them at all. Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre, Andrew Scheer, those guys know that if they start saying, hey, the U.S. ambassador and Trump have a point, we're being too mean to them, that's going to really hurt them politically, kind of reinvigorate the same kind of a sentiment that propelled Carney ahead in the first place. And on the other hand, the Liberals will say, and this kind of goes to Dan's point, that they never really argued boycott. They were saying buy Canadian, but they were never saying boycott, stop traveling there. They just said travel here more, buy Canadian stuff more.
Dan, do you think it's fair to characterize what's happening as an anti-American sentiment?
Depends which side of the border you are, I guess. I guess if you're the U.S. ambassador to Canada, it might feel that way. But I don't think it's perceived that way, at least not completely that way within Canada. And to Jason's point, I think it would be hard for anyone to say, yeah, maybe the U.S. ambassador has a point. On the political level, the Conservatives have been hammering at the government elbows down for backing off of the digital service tax, the counter tariff that Justin Trudeau had adopted early on during the trade war. So it's a legitimate sentiment, and I'm sure when you show up in a country and you look at the way people perceive your country, it triggers that kind of reaction. But I don't think it requires any kind of reaction on our side.
I guess I would say too, there is something to parse about the difference between anti-American sentiment versus anti-U.S. administration sentiment. Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's a feeling, and I'm certainly not encouraging this, but it's not like Canadians are out there saying, oh, all those Americans are terrible people and we should be wary of them. This is very much, as you guys said, that it's based in this pushback on the 51st state.
You're right, Catherine. People are more anti-Trump, but when they refuse to travel and when they refuse to buy American products, they are hurting all Americans. So it's, there's this sort of collective effect on not just Trump, but all the people that Hoekstra purports to represent.
And yet, here in New York, a couple of times, I was stopped or told by people who realized that I was Canadian, oh, we're sorry. I got an apologies from U.S. citizens for the behavior of their president. I suspect those people are Democrats. I suspect.
Did you accept the apology?
Gracefully. Then I smiled. And then we moved on. But I thought it was interesting, and they were very nice. And it's anecdotal. It happened to me. I was having dinner with a former colleague of mine, Louis Blouin, not to name him, last night, who's been traveling around the U.S. for the past few weeks, and he's meeting people who are going to him and apologizing for the behavior of their president. Now, how well do we think this Buy Canadian push is working? Still can't buy any kind of American booze in Quebec or Ontario. I was in Alberta not that long ago. I think you got some U.S. stuff back on the shelves, Jason.
Catherine, Dan, if you want me to hook you up with some bourbon or some nice California Zinfandel, talk to the Albertan here. I think it was for quite a few months now, since the summer, they restocked shelves with U.S. alcohol. As part of Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe have been more elbows down in at least their government policy on liquor, and in fact encouraging the Canadian government to ease some of its counter tariffs. So if there's one audience that some of Hoekstra's arguments may play well to, it is Albertans. It is people in the Prairie West. It's ironic because, well, maybe it's not ironic, maybe it's telling, because it's in Saskatchewan and Alberta that we're feeling the least effect of the tariffs. We produce oil, agricultural products. These are not being affected by tariffs. And maybe you're seeing that in the public. I mean, Hoekstra is supposed to be coming out during his listening tour of his. He's coming out to Calgary and Edmonton, I believe, later on this fall. And he may have some of the best responses. Around 4th of July, there was an annual party, a garden party that the Consul General hosts. And I've heard that the Ottawa one was pretty poorly attended. And I was really curious when I went, and I almost went more, on a lark, just to rubberneck, see what the mood was here. And it was humming about as much as it always was. I think people in Alberta and to some extent Saskatchewan are ready to keep going with the relationship. And part of that might be because, given that there are no tariffs on oil products, the relationship seems to be in some part normal.
Two things on that. I was invited but couldn't make it to the Ambassador Garden Party this summer. But a few friends who went told me that it was significantly less people than the year before. In one case, a friend told me half. Another friend told me closer to a third of those who attended the year before. So it had an impact on this side. I think because of the impact the tariffs have in Quebec and Ontario, you wouldn't see the same kind of behavior here than you see in Alberta. I don't think François Legault or Doug Ford can put back U.S. booze on the shelves at the SAQ or at the LCBO because of the tariffs on aluminum and softwood lumber in Quebec, because of the car industry, the auto manufacturing in Ontario and the steel industry. I think if they tried that, it would probably trigger a backlash. Doug Ford poured out a bottle of Crown Royal just because the bottling manufacturer moved to the U.S. And so that tells you what kind of reaction you would expect if he was starting to get some U.S. bourbon back on the shelves. And by the way, if you're looking for a good bourbon for an old-fashioned, I have a friend who has a bar who showed me a good Canadian substitution, so we maybe don't have to go through Jason's channel quite yet.
I just think the next time we should do this with beverages. Listen, it's interesting. On this, I want to get into the numbers in a second, but we bought a couch earlier this summer from a place that makes couches in Canada, and I was talking to the guy at the store and saying, like, oh, have you guys seen a real sort of burst in new purchases because you're a Canadian-based company? And he said, that wave is sort of over, which I thought was a really striking sentiment. This would have been in, mid-July. The numbers do not suggest that. I'm sorry to my friend at the couch store. But in fact, our colleague JP Tasker just put together a piece that takes a look at a lot of different numbers, what it tells us about Buy Canadian. Here are some that stood out. Statistics Canada says the number of Canadian residents coming back from the U.S. by car in August dropped 34% compared to the same month last year. That is the 8th consecutive month of year-over-year declines. It's not just crossing the border by car, returning by air, down a quarter in August compared to the previous year. Canadian exports to the U.S., according to Stats Can, have dropped by about 2% this year. So not a great big number, but we are exporting a lot more to other countries around the world. And here's just one more that we can kind of maybe get our hands around. Canadian authored books, according to Indigo, which is the country's largest bookseller, are up 25% year over year. So it's interesting to look at the different ways, whether it's travel, whether it's just like engaging with Canadian stuff. There are signs this campaign is still going.
Part of that on the travel side is not going to be just a fence over to the 51st state, the boycott. It's going to be a more real fear from people that crossing the border has become a lot more difficult given what ICE is doing, given what the border control and all these horror stories you hear about people trying to, having to take wiped phones, worried that they're going to have their social media thing, worried they're going to be turned around because of something they may have posted on social media or said to a border guard. So that sort of thing is going to linger a lot longer than any hurt feelings, it seems.
Yeah, it's visceral, for sure. Okay, well, I want to talk a little bit more about why we think the ambassador might be pushing back and whether it will work, whether the business community is listening. Let's get to that right after the break.
So the U.S. ambassador has been giving these talks at Chambers of Commerce. Cullen, do you think that there's a specific strategy in him doing it there and not talking in other outlets?
I do think he explicitly said in this particular conversation that's gotten so much attention that he does believe that the business community is passionate about the Canada-U.S. relationship. He just wishes they would be a little louder. So, he's being pretty explicit about it. I'd like you folks to speak up a little bit more. But I was speaking to someone sort of in the business world who knows Pete Hoekstra fairly well. And this person was making the case to me that he's really talking about politicians. And in fact, if you look at his remarks, that is pretty plain. His complaint is that Mark Carney ran an anti-American campaign. You could argue that the Conservatives did something very similar. And I think he's feeling frustration about the way the political conversation is going. It's interesting. Pete Buttigieg, the former U.S. Transportation Secretary, a well-known Democrat, some people think he might be president one day. Well, he was in Ottawa on Monday night for an event. And he made the case that what's happening right now is just a storm in the Canada-U.S. relationship, and it's one that will pass when the end of the Trump administration comes. I do think there's a lot to think about there, both the sentiments of Canadians, right? Like, is this something that we're just all holding off, going to see a Broadway show, but we're hopeful we can do it again in 3 years, if indeed you are trying to buy Canadian and stay out of the U.S.? Or is this about a bigger change? And that's such a relevant question for businesses because the whole argument from the Prime Minister and frankly from Pierre Poilievre too, right, is about diversifying the economy. Whereas I think what Pete Hoekstra is ultimately saying, and what some in the business community in Canada are saying, is geography, history, there's so much here that means that this relationship just makes sense. And so we've got to find a way to make it work because it's just too big to turn too far away from.
And it does make sense. And every time we hit a bump on the road of trading between the two nations, and let's remember the first Trump mandate, the renegotiation of NAFTA back then, which is now called CUSMA, we had the same kind of reaction from the same Canadian politicians saying we need to diversify, we need to look at new markets. And then at some point things get better and you go back to the U.S. because it's right there, it's easy, it's across the border. I think talking to the business community, despite the fact that it's political, he's talking about the political message. The business community is much more open to receiving that message than the average Canadian would be, because for the people at home, people listening to us today, it's visceral. It's something that it really hurts them. And so they're not willing to kiss and make up right away. So focusing on the business community, the business leaders, probably the right crowd.
The other part of that is that the business communities are more likely to come down to bear on the politicians, because politicians aren't coming down to bear on politicians, but the business community will. And part of the reason is because, unlike the Canadians who feel viscerally about it, businesses can't just boycott. They can't just stop visiting. They can't just stop buying. They have, very life or death relationships built up over time with U.S. businesses, with U.S. customers, with U.S. suppliers. And, while it's easy for, one of us at home to say, I'm going to change where I'm going for my summer vacation, businesses can't do that. It's not so easy to turn the boat around and diversify. But let's keep in mind that while some people in the business community may be the most likely to echo what Hoekstra is saying. Not all businesses are going to be the same. Not all business leaders, because different business groups are feeling things differently. Like, think about how Flavio Volpe of the auto parts industry, think about what he's saying.
Well, when you kick the dog, you can't blame it for snarling back. And they did that for the first 3 months or so. When you talk about annexation and you talk about 51st state and you treat your partner like a second class standing, and then say, well, you know what? I think that when you say things like elbows up, it's anti-American. I mean, it's gaslighting 101. I try to ignore his rhetoric. We've met several times and look at the things he's saying that are slightly positive, which is they talk about the USMCA like it's of value to them. Well, that's important. That might be a window into the future.
Are we the dog in this metaphor? I think, unfortunately, we are. I do think that speaks to, actually what's making people so angry, a subsection of Canadians so angry about these comments by Pete Hoekstra. And I will say here at CBC News, we have all kinds of ways of measuring how much interest there are in our stories, particularly anything we put online. There's a lot of interest in what the ambassador had to say. Why are people reacting so strongly? It's because I think it circumvents this 51st state business. And it's true, Donald Trump hasn't trotted that out in a while. And when you look at how Pete Hoekstra has approached this job, he's kind of trying to pretend like that. He just wants to put it in a corner, shove it in a closet, close the door on it, say that chapter is over. It doesn't really matter. You can't take it seriously. I'm here. Let's move on with things. But the memories of many Canadians are a fair bit longer than that. Jason, you want to get in here?
And I think part of the whole purpose of what he's trying to do is to get people talking about U.S. sentiment. And I guess, well, maybe even we've kind of fallen prey to that.
But I think there's something to be said for just letting it kind of peter out right now, so that the next time you have to make a decision about what you're going to buy online or this or that, you're just feeling a little bit less angry and you're like, maybe I'll buy these Etsy earrings from a U.S. jewelry maker because I can't find anyone in Canada. Not that I know anyone who would make a decision like that. But there's a bigger overarching issue here. It was actually a greeting card. Anyway, never mind. There's a bigger overarching issue here, which is not just the situation with tariffs, right? But the broader issue of free trade between Canada and the U.S. Carney is in the U.S. He's talking about the Canada-U.S. relationship under this rubric of how it's going, CUSMA and whatnot. And it came up on Monday when he spoke before the Council of Foreign Relations. Let's listen to that.
One thing I'd impress upon the audience is that Canadians understand the need to, as we put it, to be masters in our own house. The country does not want to wake up and look on, all due respect, on Truth Social or X to see what the latest change is in U.S. policy, but wants to get on with what we can control.
CUSMA, USMCA, it's up for review. The process is formally started, certainly in the U.S. What has Carney been able to control this week abroad, Dan?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure he's got control on anything, but what you've just heard is him making a pitch to the business community in the U.S. And why does he do that? Because the business community in the U.S. has the ear of the president, or presumably has better access and can pass a message to the president of the United States. Business are hurting on this side because of some of the tariffs decisions that were made by the Trump administration. And so I think it was a smart thing to do for Carney to go in front of that audience and say, this is the way we're gonna work from now on, because we need to have a little more predictability and we need to be able to know where we're going from now on. And so I think that's part of the broader agenda that the Carney government has to put forward. There is a reception organized by the U.S. by Donald Trump tonight in New York, in the margin of the UN, and Prime Minister Carney will go. I'm sure he will try to find its way with a cocktail in his hand towards Donald Trump and maybe have a bit of a conversation about tariffs or say something or try to advance the marker a little bit. That's not what he was doing with the business community yesterday, or not, at least not that directly. And by the way, Catherine, I'm slightly disappointed. There's great greeting cards maker in Canada.
was a very specific one. I will say, though, that Carney's cocktail, will it be bourbon-free? There's the question you should be trying to figure out. And just so everyone knows, we are recording this episode on Tuesday, although I believe it's going to drop for folks on Wednesday. So we may know just how well that reception did or did not go. Jason, what do you think?
What's so interesting to listen to Carney at the Council on Foreign Relations, it's how kind of old school, kind of a pre-Trump it is. Like Carney, almost, what the Trump people would say was globalist. He's talking fondly of multilateralism, about accomplishing things. The day after Trump left at the G7, talking to this very, even just a very Council of Foreign Relations seems like a pre-Trump, kind of a non-Trump entity, this sort of like, this genteel organization of leaders, business leaders and political leaders who want to come talk about the way things should be, the way things are as well, but also the way countries of like mind can cooperate and collaborate for a collective betterment. Carney seems to be, in a way, pining for that pre-Trump order or post-Trump order. As much as he says the current one is ruptured, it's clear that he would much prefer the order in which he was central banker in. And you know what? There are probably a lot of Canadians who feel the same way.
Well, and he's trying to keep that sort of sense of normalcy alive outside of the Trump orbit, right? Canada is the most European of non-European nations, creating all these new ties to Europe in particular. But the other question that I think hangs over this, everyone understands that Trump is going to continue to be a disruptive force. So when you look at these free trade negotiations, the question we have to ask ourselves might just be, how bad is this going to get? Are we just going to get a rough ride on dairy and, a handful of other issues that perhaps we haven't spent a lot of time thinking about in the last few months? Or is this another flip the table moment for Donald Trump, right? I mean, Mark Carney has been hammering this idea that Canada and Mexico, as he said when he was in Mexico last week, have the best deal on free trade, and it is the modern incarnation of NAFTA. Do any of us think that we live in a world where we can be so sure that Trump's not going to flip the table on that and just come at this some terrible new way that is going to wreak further havoc on the Canadian economy?
And maybe in the same way that Hoekstra is trying to appeal to the business community there, Carney's best bet on preventing Trump from doing anything is getting the business community in the U.S. to come to bear on Trump, because they don't like tariffs as much as Canada doesn't.
To Catherine's point, I don't think we can have any insurance that there's nothing bad coming down our way with the renegotiation of CUSMA. So we'll see how that goes. I think right now the Canadian government is doing its best to prepare for what will likely be a bit of a bumpy ride. And I think we have to get ready for anything. I think dairy is a good example. It's something that the U.S. has been, and the president has said many times that he was hoping to go after that. That, probably other things. So, yeah, it's a weird world we're living in as far as trade goes right now. I
was going to say we started talking about hurt feelings, and I feel so much better now that I've talked to you guys. It's not true. That was a really unsettling note to end on. But I'm going to go ease my feelings by getting myself a latte with some nice Canadian milk in it.
And some Canadian corn whiskey, too?
It's too early for bourbon, unfortunately.
I was about to say, it's probably better to go for coffee right now. See you drinks later.
See you guys later. Have a great week. Okay, that is it for House Party this week. Thanks to my co-hosts Jason Markusoff and Danielle Thibeault, and thanks to the amazing production team Kristen Everson and Jennifer Chevalier. Remember to catch my other show, The House, in this same podcast feed, landing every Saturday morning, and House Party will be back next Wednesday with another big, burning political question.